The fall of Dean and the beginning of unlikely friendships. Dean, once a man of ambition and determination, found himself sitting on the cold pavement of a busy street corner. The city hummed around him, indifferent to his presence. He was in his early 40s, yet his gaunt face and sunken eyes told a story of hardship that seemed to have aged him beyond his years. He hadn't always been this way, begging for spare change, watching the world pass him by, barely noticed by the people who rushed through their lives. Dean's journey to the streets was a slow descent, one that began long before he found himself clutching a small cardboard sign with the words, "Anything helps," scrawled in shaky letters. He had once been a man with dreams, a man who believed in hard work and the promise of a better future. He had never completed college, but that didn't stop him from hustling, from throwing himself into every job that came his way. He saved what little he could and eventually poured his heart and soul into a small business, a local repair shop that quickly became known for its reliability and Dean's personal touch. For years, the shop thrived. Dean became a familiar face in his community, someone who was always willing to help out, to go the extra mile for his customers. He wasn't rich, but he was proud of what he had built. Yet, as life often does, it threw an unexpected curveball. The economy took a downturn, and his business, like many others, started to struggle. At first, he tried to hold on, to make ends meet, but the debts piled up, and soon, the bills were too much for him to bear. Despite his best efforts, his beloved repair shop had to close its doors. What followed was a series of misfortunes that left Dean reeling. Without his business, his identity as a hardworking, self-sufficient man felt stripped away. The loss of income meant that he could no longer afford his modest apartment, and within months, he was living out of his car. When even that was taken from him, towed away when he could no longer keep up with the payments, Dean found himself on the streets, with nothing to his name, but a few belongings and a blanket he had managed to hold on to. But Dean was different from the other beggars who lined the streets. He wasn't bitter or angry. In fact, he still greeted everyone with a smile, a wave, and a genuine thank you whenever someone spared him some change or food. He remembered faces too. If someone helped him once, he made sure to thank them again the next time they passed by. His memory was sharp, and people appreciated his gratitude. Over time, his small corner of the city became his regular spot, and he became a familiar sight for the passers-by. But what truly set Dean apart was something that began to happen unexpectedly, a development that would not only change his life, but also catch the attention of the entire neighborhood and eventually the world. It all started on a particularly cold autumn day. Dean had managed to gather just enough change to buy himself a small meal, a sandwich and a cup of soup. As he sat on the corner, savoring the warmth of the food, he noticed a stray dog watching him from a distance. The dog was small and scruffy, its fur matted and dirty, with eyes that spoke of hunger and caution. It sniffed the air cautiously, its thin frame trembling slightly in the cool breeze. Dean, who had always had a soft spot for animals, couldn't ignore the pitiful sight of the dog. Without a second thought, he tore off a piece of his sandwich and gently tossed it in the dog's direction. The dog hesitated for a moment, eyeing Dean warily, but the smell of food was too tempting. Slowly, it approached, sniffing the piece of bread before quickly snatching it up and retreating a few steps. For a while, Dean and the dog sat in silence, each watching the other. Dean, not wanting to scare the animal away, ate the rest of his meal in small bites, occasionally tossing more pieces of bread to the dog, which continued to inch closer with each offering. By the time his meal was finished, the dog was sitting just a few feet away, its trust still tentative but growing. That night, as Dean curled up under his blanket, the dog remained close, lying a short distance away, its head resting on its paws. It didn't approach Dean directly, but it stayed near enough that Dean could hear its soft breathing through the night. And when morning came, the dog was still there, watching him with those same cautious eyes. Over the next few days, the routine continued. The dog, which Dean decided to name Scott, would show up around the same time each day, waiting for a share of whatever food Dean had managed to scrounge up. And each day, Scott grew a little more comfortable, edging closer until one morning, Dean awoke to find the dog curled up right beside him, its head resting against his side. Their bond had formed, and soon, people passing by began to notice the pair. At first, they assumed Scott was Dean's longtime companion, a loyal pet that had stuck by him through thick and thin. But that wasn't the case. Scott had been a stray, just like so many others that roamed the streets, looking for scraps to survive. Dean, however, couldn't let that continue. He knew what it felt like to have nothing, to be ignored by the world, and he wasn't about to let Scott feel that way anymore. He made a silent vow to care for the dog as best he could, even if it meant giving up part of his own meals. As the days turned into weeks, Scott's presence became a constant in Dean's life. Wherever Dean went, Scott followed, his scruffy tail wagging happily whenever Dean reached down to give him a gentle pat. And then something unexpected happened. More stray dogs began to show up. One by one, the other dogs in the area started to gravitate toward Dean. It was as if they had sensed something different about him, something kind and welcoming. At first, there were only 2 or 3 additional dogs that would come by, wagging their tails and sitting patiently as Dean shared whatever food he had. But soon, the number grew, and within a few months, Dean found himself surrounded by nearly a dozen stray dogs. People in the neighborhood started to take notice. It wasn't every day that you saw a man on the street with a pack of dogs sitting calmly by his side. Some thought it was strange, while others couldn't help but be moved by the sight. After all, Dean had so little to give, yet he was willing to share what little he had with these animals, ensuring they didn't go hungry. What started with Scott had turned into something much bigger, a small, unlikely community of strays, brought together by one man's compassion. And while Dean didn't know it yet, his actions were about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. This was just the beginning of Dean's journey with the stray dogs, and soon, the reason behind their daily visits would shock the world. But for now, they were simply companions, finding solace in each other's company as the city buzzed on, unaware of the extraordinary bond that was forming right before its eyes, a growing family of strays. As the sun rose over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the pavement, Dean stirred beneath his worn-out blanket. Scott, his faithful companion, was already awake, sitting alert beside him, ears twitching to the sounds of early morning traffic. Around them, the streets were slowly coming to life. People walking briskly to work, cars honking in the distance. But amidst the hustle, there was a quiet corner that seemed almost serene, as if it existed in a world apart from the busy city. The corner where Dean and his growing family of stray dogs sat together. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, Dean sharing his food with one hungry dog, had now become something much bigger. Word seemed to have spread among the strays in the area, as more and more dogs began to join the small group. Each day, a new face appeared, thin, mangy, eyes filled with a mix of hope and caution. And each day, Dean welcomed them with open arms, offering them what little food he could spare and, more importantly, a place where they could feel safe. At first, the dogs would come and go. Some would visit Dean for a meal or a pat on the head before wandering off into the city. Others, like Scott, chose to stay by Dean's side, forming a permanent bond with him. Over time, however, more of the dogs began to stick around, as if they had found something in Dean that they couldn't find elsewhere, a sense of belonging, of being cared for, even if their caretaker had so little himself. The change didn't go unnoticed by the people who passed through the neighborhood. For weeks, the sight of Dean surrounded by stray dogs had intrigued, and in some cases, puzzled passersby. Most people had long since grown used to ignoring beggars, treating them as invisible, but there was something different about Dean. Maybe it was the way he greeted everyone with a smile, or the way he never complained, never acted like the world owed him anything. Or maybe it was the sight of all those dogs, silent, well-behaved, and somehow drawn to this man who had nothing to give except his compassion. One morning, as Dean sat in his usual spot, a woman named Claire stopped in front of him, her arms full of grocery bags. She had passed by him several times before on her way to and from work, and like most people, she had noticed the dogs. Today, however, curiosity got the better of her. "Excuse me," she said, crouching down beside him. "I've seen you here before, and I couldn't help but notice all the dogs. Are they yours?" Dean looked up at her, surprised by the question. Most people didn't bother talking to him. They just dropped a coin or two into his cup and hurried on their way. He smiled warmly. "No, not really. They're strays. They just come to me, I guess." Claire glanced at the dogs, who were lying quietly around Dean, their eyes following her movements but showing no signs of aggression. "Why do they stay with you? I mean, they're not your pets, right?" Dean shook his head. "No, they're not. But I think they stay because they know I'll look out for them. I don't have much, but I try to share what I can. I guess they sense that." There was a quiet sincerity in Dean's voice that made Claire pause. She had seen plenty of beggars in the city, but there was something about Dean that felt different. His relationship with the dogs seemed almost magical, like something out of a storybook. "That's really kind of you," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't go out of their way to help animals like this." Dean shrugged, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I figure they need someone to care about them. I know what it's like to be forgotten, to feel like nobody cares. I guess I don't want them to feel that way." As days turned into weeks, Dean's small family of stray dogs continued to grow. Each new addition came with its own story. Some had been abandoned by their owners, others had been born on the streets and had never known a home. Regardless of where they came from, they all seemed to find their way to Dean, as if guided by some invisible force. One of the new arrivals was a large black dog with a scar across his muzzle. Dean named him Shadow. Shadow was wary at first, keeping his distance from both Dean and the other dogs. He was older, with patches of gray fur around his snout and eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship. For days, he stayed on the fringes, watching the others from afar, but never approaching. But Dean, as patient as ever, made sure to leave some food for Shadow each time he fed the other dogs. Eventually, Shadow began to trust Dean. It started with small steps. First, he crept closer to the group, then he began eating the food Dean left for him. And finally, one chilly evening, he curled up beside Scott and the others, finding warmth and companionship among them. From that day on, Shadow became a permanent member of Dean's growing pack. With every new dog that joined the group, Dean found himself thinking about how far he had come, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of purpose. Before, his days had been filled with loneliness and uncertainty, but now, even though he still faced the same struggles, hunger, cold, and the ever-present challenge of finding enough money to survive, he didn't feel quite so alone anymore. The dogs had given him a reason to get up each day, to keep going even when things seemed hopeless. The city, however, wasn't always kind to strays. As Dean's pack grew, so did the challenges. The authorities had a strict policy against stray animals, and it wasn't long before Dean's little corner attracted the wrong kind of attention. One morning, 2 animal control officers appeared, their truck parked a few feet away as they approached Dean with stern expressions. "Sir," one of them said, glancing at the dogs, "we've received complaints about a large number of stray dogs in this area. We're going to have to take them in." Dean's heart sank. He had known this day might come, but he wasn't ready for it. "Please," he said, his voice steady but pleading. "These dogs, they don't have anyone else. I take care of them. They're not causing any harm." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces softening slightly. "We understand that you care for them," the second officer said, "but they're still strays. We can't just let them roam the streets. It's not safe for them, or for the people in the area." Dean nodded, understanding their position, but feeling a deep sense of loss. He had grown attached to each of these dogs, and the thought of losing them, of seeing them taken to a shelter where their futures were uncertain, was almost unbearable. Before the officers could move forward, however, something unexpected happened. A small crowd had gathered nearby. Neighbors, passers-by, people who had seen Dean and his dogs over the past months. One by one, they began to speak up. "These dogs aren't dangerous," an elderly man said, stepping forward. "They're always calm. They don't cause any trouble. I see them every day on my way to work," another woman chimed in. "They just sit there quietly with him. I think it's wonderful what he's doing." Even Claire, the woman who had first stopped to talk to Dean, was among them. "He's helping these animals," she said firmly. "If it weren't for him, they'd be starving, or worse." The officers, taken aback by the sudden outpouring of support, hesitated. It wasn't often that they encountered such resistance, especially in cases involving stray animals. After a brief, quiet discussion, they turned back to Dean. "All right," one of them said with a sigh. "We won't take them today. But you need to make sure they don't become a problem. We'll be back to check in." Dean nodded, relief washing over him as the officers left. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who had stood up for him and his dogs, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. That evening, as Dean sat with his pack of strays, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger. These dogs, once unwanted and forgotten, had found a home in him, and in doing so, had brought the community together in ways he could never have imagined. The challenges were far from over, but Dean was no longer facing them alone. He had his dogs by his side. And, as it turned out, a growing number of people who cared as well. But the story was far from over. Dean and his newfound family were about to become the center of attention in ways neither he nor the world could have predicted. This chapter marked a turning point in Dean's life. From here on, things would only get more extraordinary, as the world began to take notice of the bond between one man and his pack of stray dogs. The world takes notice. Dean sat in his usual spot, surrounded by the familiar warmth of his loyal dogs. The day had begun like any other. Bright morning light casting shadows across the busy street, people walking briskly past him on their way to work, and the occasional jingling of coins being dropped into his cup. The once constant ache of loneliness that had gnawed at him for years was now a distant memory, replaced by the quiet companionship of his furry friends. But today, something was different. It began with a few passers-by stopping longer than usual, their curious eyes lingering on the sight of Dean and his ever-growing family of stray dogs. Some even pulled out their phones, snapping photos or recording short videos of the man who sat in peaceful harmony with the once homeless animals. Dean noticed it but paid little attention, as he was more focused on ensuring that each of his dogs got a little bit of food. As the day progressed, more people seemed to take an interest in Dean's corner of the street. By the afternoon, a small crowd had gathered, not just the usual faces of locals or passers-by, but new faces, strangers who had heard whispers about the man with the dogs. They stood a few feet away, talking amongst themselves and watching the scene unfold as if it were something extraordinary. Unbeknownst to Dean, something had shifted in the world around him. Earlier that morning, a video of him and his dogs had been uploaded to social media by a young woman who had passed by on her way to work. In the short clip, Dean could be seen gently petting Shadow, while a few other dogs rested their heads in his lap. The caption read, "This man cares for every stray dog in the neighborhood, with nothing but kindness and compassion. Humanity at its finest." The video quickly gained traction. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, reaching people far beyond the city. Comments poured in, filled with admiration, surprise, and even disbelief. Some were touched by Dean's selflessness, while others marveled at the loyalty and calmness of the dogs. It wasn't long before the video caught the attention of local news outlets, and soon after, journalists began making their way to Dean's corner to find out more about the story behind the man and his dogs. By the next morning, Dean found himself facing something he had never expected: the spotlight. When he arrived at his usual spot, there was already a small group of reporters waiting for him, cameras in hand, eager to ask questions. Dean was taken aback. This was a world far removed from his quiet, unnoticed life on the streets. He had spent years feeling invisible, a man who had faded into the background of the city's bustling life. But now, it seemed, the world had taken notice. "Excuse me, sir," one of the reporters called out as Dean settled down with Scott and the others. "Are you the man who's been caring for all these stray dogs?" Dean hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had never been one for the spotlight and felt uncomfortable with all the attention. Still, he didn't want to be rude. "Yes, I suppose I am," he replied quietly, giving a nervous smile. "Can you tell us why you do it?" Another reporter asked, her microphone extended toward him. "Why take care of so many stray dogs, especially when you're struggling yourself?" Dean scratched the back of his neck, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. He glanced down at Scott, who was now resting his head on Dean's knee, looking up at him with those loyal, trusting eyes. "I guess it's because they need someone," Dean said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "I don't have much, but I know what it's like to be abandoned, to feel like nobody cares whether you live or die. I don't want these dogs to feel that way. They're just like us. They need food, love, and a little kindness." There was a pause as the reporters and onlookers absorbed Dean's words. For a moment, there was no sound except for the distant hum of the city. Then, a few of the reporters smiled, nodding appreciatively at his sincerity. The questions continued for a while longer, each one more probing than the last. Dean answered them as best he could, though he remained humble, never once trying to make himself seem like a hero. In his mind, he was just doing what anyone with compassion would do, helping those in need, whether they were people or animals. But the journalists were fascinated by his story, seeing in him something special, something that the world needed to hear about. Over the following days, Dean's story spread even further. The local news ran a feature on him, which was picked up by national networks. Soon, people from all across the country were talking about the man who cared for the strays. Social media exploded with posts, comments, and hashtags celebrating his selflessness. Some even referred to him as a modern-day saint. But with the fame came challenges. The once quiet corner where Dean and his dogs had found refuge became a constant hub of activity. More and more people showed up each day, not just reporters, but regular folks who had seen the story and wanted to meet the man who had touched their hearts. Many brought food for the dogs, and some even offered money, though Dean was hesitant to accept it. "I don't do this for money," he would say whenever someone tried to hand him a bill. "If you want to help, bring something for the dogs. They're the ones who need it." And they did. Bags of dog food, blankets, and other supplies began to pile up around Dean's spot, donations from people who had been moved by his story. Some days it felt overwhelming, the sheer number of people who now seemed invested in his life. But at the same time, Dean couldn't deny the good it had brought. For the first time in months, he didn't have to worry about where the next meal for his dogs would come from. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost, drifting through the world unnoticed. As the days went by, something else began to happen. People started coming not just to see Dean but to adopt the dogs. Families, individuals, even rescue organizations reached out, offering to give the strays a home. One by one, the dogs that had once been forgotten found new families, their tails wagging as they left Dean's side for the first time. It was bittersweet for Dean. On the one hand, he was overjoyed to see the dogs he had cared for finally getting the lives they deserved, warm homes, plenty of food, and people who would love them as much as he had. But on the other hand, saying goodbye was harder than he expected. These dogs had become his family, his constant companions through the toughest days of his life. Each time one left, Dean would sit quietly for a few moments, letting the weight of the farewell settle in. He would watch as they trotted off with their new owners, tails high, heads held proudly. And though his heart ached a little with each departure, he reminded himself that this was what he had always wanted, for the dogs to have a better life than the streets could offer. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, Claire, the woman who had first stopped to talk to Dean weeks ago, appeared at his side once more. This time, she wasn't alone. She had brought with her a group of volunteers from a local animal rescue group, all of whom had been deeply inspired by Dean's story. "Dean," Claire said, kneeling beside him, "we've been talking, and we want to help in a bigger way. You've done so much for these dogs, and we think it's time for you to have some help." Dean raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "Help how?" he asked. Claire smiled warmly. "We want to set up a proper shelter, a place where these dogs can stay until they're adopted. You wouldn't have to worry about the authorities coming after you or the dogs being out in the cold. We'd handle the food, the vet care, everything. You'd still be part of it, of course, if you want to be. But we think it's time to take this to the next level." Dean was speechless. A shelter? For the strays he had come to love like family. The idea seemed almost too good to be true. He had never imagined that his small act of kindness would grow into something so big, something that could change the lives of not just a few dogs, but countless others. For a long moment, Dean didn't know what to say. He looked at Claire, at the volunteers who stood behind her, at the dogs resting around him, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had started this journey alone, never expecting anything in return. But now, it seemed, the world had not only taken notice, but had decided to give back in ways he could never have imagined. "Thank you," Dean finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Claire smiled again, her eyes warm with understanding. "You don't have to repay us, Dean. You've already done more than enough." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the street, Dean sat surrounded by the love of his dogs and the kindness of strangers who had become friends. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, he could see a future filled with hope, a future where both he and the dogs would no longer be invisible. The world had taken notice, and together they would continue to change it. A new chapter begins. With the plan for the shelter in motion, Dean felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since his world had turned upside down, he was not merely surviving, but actively working towards something meaningful. As the days passed, Dean became increasingly involved with Claire and the animal rescue group. Together, they organized community outreach programs, hoping to raise awareness about stray animals and encourage adoption. The local newspaper, having reported on Dean's story, took an interest in the upcoming shelter project. They featured articles highlighting Dean's journey from homelessness to becoming an advocate for stray dogs. Soon, people began to flock to Dean's corner not only to meet him and his dogs, but also to contribute to the shelter initiative. Donations began pouring in: cash, food supplies, blankets, and even building materials for the shelter. One sunny Saturday morning, Claire organized a community event at the park to promote the shelter project. She invited Dean to share his story with a wider audience. Standing before a small crowd of enthusiastic locals, Dean felt a surge of nerves. He had never spoken publicly before, but the support of the crowd and the glimmer of hope for the dogs gave him the courage he needed. "Thank you all for being here," Dean began, his voice trembling slightly. "I never imagined my life would take such a turn. Just a few months ago, I was alone on the streets, fighting for scraps of food, feeling invisible. And then these amazing dogs came into my life, reminding me that love and kindness exist even in the darkest places." As he spoke, he saw the faces in the crowd shift from curiosity to empathy. The stories of each dog echoed in his heart, and he shared them with the audience, recounting how he had met Scott, Shadow, and the others, how each had their own tale of struggle and resilience. He watched as people leaned in, captivated by the connections he described. "I realized that, despite my own struggles, I could still make a difference. These dogs needed me, and in return, They gave me companionship and purpose. But now we have an opportunity to do something bigger, to create a place where more dogs can find love, care, and forever homes." The crowd erupted in applause, and Dean felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. It was a strange sensation. He had always thought of himself as a man who needed help. Yet here he was, inspiring others to act, to care, to join him in making a difference. After the event, several local businesses approached Claire, offering to sponsor the shelter. A veterinary clinic even volunteered to provide medical care for the dogs at no charge. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Each day, Dean found himself surrounded by people who believed in the vision he had never thought possible. As the weeks rolled by, the shelter project gained momentum. Dean and Claire worked tirelessly, rallying volunteers, coordinating with contractors, and gathering supplies. Every morning, Dean would wake up early, his heart racing with excitement at the thought of what lay ahead. The little corner of the street that had once felt so lonely and desolate was now filled with purpose and activity. On one particularly busy afternoon, Dean was sifting through donations when he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Mrs. Thompson, a kind elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had always been one of Dean's biggest supporters, often stopping by to chat and offer him food. But this time, she was accompanied by her granddaughter, Lily, a bright-eyed girl of about 8. "Dean," Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice cheerful, as she approached him. "I brought Lily to meet you and your dogs. She's been following your story, and she wanted to see you in person." Lily's eyes widened with excitement as she gazed at the dogs lounging nearby. "Can I pet them?" she asked eagerly. "Of course," Dean replied with a warm smile. "They'd love that." As Lily knelt down to pet Scott, who wagged his tail with delight, Dean couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. It was moments like this, seeing the joy and happiness on a child's face, that made his heart swell. He realized that his journey had become much more than caring for stray dogs. It was about fostering community, kindness, and compassion. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, Dean sat outside with Claire, reflecting on how far they had come. The shelter was finally taking shape, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed around them as workers busily constructed the new building. "Can you believe it's really happening?" Claire said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Dean nodded, still in disbelief. "No, I can't. Just a few months ago, I was sitting on the street, feeling lost and alone. And now I have a purpose." Claire turned serious for a moment. "You've done more than just care for the dogs, Dean. You've brought people together. You've shown them what it means to care, to give back, to be part of something bigger than themselves." Dean looked at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. "I just did what I felt was right. I never expected this much support." "You're a part of something important now," Claire continued. "People need to see that kindness exists, especially in a world that can sometimes feel so harsh. You've inspired so many, and that's just the beginning." As the shelter neared completion, the community came together for a grand opening event. Dean felt a mixture of excitement and nerves as the day approached. It wasn't just about opening a building. It was about opening a door to new lives for countless dogs. He could already envision the day when families would come in, looking for a furry friend to bring home. On the day of the opening, the park was filled with laughter and joy. Families brought their children, excited to meet the dogs and learn about adoption. There were games, food stalls, and even a local band playing cheerful music. Dean stood at the entrance of the shelter, flanked by Claire and a few volunteers, welcoming everyone who arrived. As people flowed in, Dean felt a swell of pride. He had watched countless dogs leave his care, each one finding a new home. But this day was different. It was about providing a safe haven for those still waiting for their forever families. After the speeches and introductions, Dean took a moment to step away from the crowd. He found a quiet spot near the newly built shelter, looking over the grassy area filled with families and dogs playing together. As he watched, he felt a gentle nudge at his leg. He looked down to see Scott gazing up at him, tail wagging. "You've done well, buddy," Dean said, kneeling down to scratch Scott behind the ears. "You've always been my number one." Scott leaned against him, a familiar warmth spreading through Dean's heart. It was a feeling of contentment, a sense of home. For all the challenges he had faced, all the struggles that had once felt insurmountable, he had created something beautiful. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with vibrant colors, Dean stood outside the shelter, surrounded by his loyal dogs and the joyful noise of families who had gathered for the occasion. His heart swelled with gratitude, not just for what he had accomplished, but for the community that had rallied around him. They had transformed a corner of the world together, proving that compassion could change lives. Dean knew this was only the beginning. There would always be more dogs in need, more people to reach out to, and more lives to touch. But he was ready for it, equipped with love, hope, and a community that stood beside him. In that moment, he realized that he was no longer just a man on the street. He was a beacon of hope, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could change the world. Trials and triumphs. As the weeks passed following the grand opening of the shelter, Dean found himself engulfed in a whirlwind of activities. The shelter became a bustling hub, drawing in volunteers from the neighborhood and beyond. Word spread quickly about the place where abandoned and stray dogs found refuge and love. Families began to adopt, each new home breathing life into the mission Dean had worked so hard to build. Yet, with success came challenges. Dean quickly learned that managing a shelter wasn't just about providing food and a roof over the dogs' heads. It required organization, funds, and the ability to navigate the complexities of local laws and regulations regarding animal care. Claire was invaluable in this regard, guiding him through the intricacies of running a non-profit organization. One particularly busy afternoon, while Dean was organizing the newly arrived supplies, Claire approached him with a serious expression. "Dean, we need to talk about funding. The donations have been incredible, but we're starting to run low on supplies, and the bills are piling up." Dean's heart sank. He had poured his soul into this shelter, and the thought of it struggling was overwhelming. "What do we do?" he asked, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Claire took a deep breath. "We need to start planning a fundraising event, something big to draw attention and support from the community." Dean nodded, determined to find a way. They began brainstorming ideas for an event that would not only raise funds, but also engage the community. After much discussion, they settled on an adoption and awareness fair, a day filled with activities, workshops, and opportunities for people to learn about pet care, responsible ownership, and the importance of adopting rather than shopping for pets. The weeks leading up to the event were filled with preparation. Dean and Claire rallied volunteers to help with logistics, while also reaching out to local businesses for sponsorships and donations. They coordinated with local veterinarians to offer free checkups for dogs adopted that day. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, social media buzzed with excitement, and soon, the whole town was talking about the upcoming fair. As the event day approached, Dean felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. He wanted it to be perfect, not just for the shelter, but for the dogs who had come to mean so much to him. He spent countless nights dreaming about the success of the fair, envisioning families taking home new furry friends and sharing the joy that dogs could bring into their lives. The day of the fair dawned bright and clear. Dean arrived early at the shelter, a flurry of nerves and anticipation. He watched as volunteers set up booths, decorated with balloons and colorful banners proclaiming "Adopt, don't shop." The atmosphere buzzed with energy as people arrived, drawn by the promise of love and companionship. The day unfolded beautifully. Families and children filled the shelter, engaging with the dogs, playing games, and participating in workshops. Dean moved from one activity to another, sharing stories about the dogs and connecting with potential adopters. He watched as a young couple fell in love with a shy Labrador mix, coaxing her out of her shell with treats and gentle encouragement. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fair, Dean stepped back to take in the scene. Laughter filled the air, and he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. People were adopting dogs, and those who weren't were still contributing through donations and pledges. The sense of community was palpable. Neighbors were engaging with each other, sharing their love for animals, and celebrating the mission Dean had started. However, just as Dean felt the event was going splendidly, a sudden commotion erupted at one of the booths. A small boy had tripped and fallen. His ice cream splattered across the pavement, and he began to cry. Dean rushed over, his heart aching at the sight of the child's disappointment. Kneeling down, he offered comforting words and gestured toward the petting zoo area, where fluffy puppies were waiting to be cuddled. "Hey, buddy, look over there. Why don't we clean you up and go play with the puppies? I bet they'll make you smile again," Dean suggested. The boy's face lit up at the mention of puppies. With the help of his mother, they cleaned him up and made their way to the petting area. Dean watched as the little boy's tears transformed into giggles, surrounded by wagging tails and playful pups. It was moments like these that made all the hard work worth it. By the end of the day, the fair had surpassed all expectations. Dean and Claire gathered in a small circle to review the donations collected, and Dean's heart swelled as they tallied the numbers. "This is incredible," he exclaimed, unable to contain his excitement. Claire smiled widely. "We did it, Dean. The shelter is going to be okay for a while, and we can even plan for future programs." As the evening drew to a close, families began to leave with their new furry companions, laughter echoing through the air. Dean felt a warmth in his heart as he watched a family walk away, a small dog nestled in their arms, tail wagging happily. This was what he had envisioned when he began this journey, a chance for these dogs to find loving homes and families to discover the joy of companionship. The next few days were filled with a flurry of activity. With the success of the fair, Dean had renewed energy and motivation to expand their efforts. He and Claire set meetings to discuss new initiatives, such as training programs for adopters, workshops on responsible pet ownership, and outreach programs for schools to teach children about kindness to animals. However, in the midst of this success, Dean learned that not everyone shared his enthusiasm. One afternoon, while he was outside the shelter with his dogs, a group of men approached. They wore grim expressions, and Dean felt a sense of unease wash over him. "What do you think you're doing, taking up space here?" One of the men growled, his tone aggressive. "You're just a beggar. Why do you think you can run a shelter?" Dean stood tall, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "I'm not just a beggar. I'm a person trying to make a difference. These dogs need love and care, and I'm here to provide that." The men exchanged glances, and the leader scoffed. "This neighborhood doesn't need more stray dogs. You're just attracting trouble." Dean felt anger rise within him, but he took a deep breath, remembering the mission he had embarked upon. "I believe every life is worth saving, including these dogs. They deserve a chance, just like anyone else. If you feel differently, then that's your choice. But I won't back down." The confrontation escalated briefly, with heated words exchanged, but Dean stood firm in his conviction. Eventually, the men walked away, their words lingering in the air like a dark cloud. But instead of feeling defeated, Dean felt empowered. He knew that for every person who doubted him, there were many more who believed in the mission of the shelter. That evening, Dean shared the incident with Claire, who listened attentively, her expression serious. "You handled that well, Dean. It's never easy when people challenge our beliefs, especially when they come from a place of misunderstanding." "I know, but it still stings," Dean admitted. "It's frustrating to think that people would rather see these dogs suffer than offer them a chance at a better life." Claire placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You have to remember that change takes time. The more we share our message and show the community the joy these dogs can bring, the more support we'll gain. Don't let negativity deter you from your path." Dean nodded, feeling encouraged by her words. He understood that he could not control how others thought, but he could control his actions and the impact he made. He was determined to turn this challenge into motivation, pushing forward with his vision for the shelter. As days turned into weeks, Dean focused on the positive. He immersed himself in the community, hosting workshops, organizing volunteer days, and sharing success stories of the dogs that had been adopted. Each time he saw a family leave with a new furry friend, his heart swelled with pride. Yet, in the shadows, the negativity lingered. Dean began receiving anonymous letters, each filled with harsh words about his work at the shelter and claims that he was endangering the community by bringing in more stray dogs. While the letters stung, Dean resolved to rise above the negativity. One day, after a long shift at the shelter, Dean sat outside with Scott, reflecting on everything that had happened. It was a peaceful evening, and the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes, allowing the sounds of barking and laughter to wash over him. Then, an unexpected voice interrupted his thoughts. Dean. He opened his eyes to see a familiar face. Mrs. Thompson, with Lily and Tao. "Hi, Dean. We wanted to stop by and see how things are going." Dean smiled warmly. "It's going well. We've had a lot of adoptions lately, and the community has really come together." Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Can I help too?" she asked eagerly. "Of course, Lily. We would love your help," Dean replied, motioning for her to join him. He took her on a tour of the shelter, showing her the different areas where the dogs lived and played. As he talked, Dean could see the sparkle of passion igniting in her eyes, much like his own had when he first began this journey. As they walked through the shelter, Dean felt a renewed sense of hope. The community's support was unwavering, and he realized that for every negative voice, there were many more positive ones lifting him up. Inspired by Lily's enthusiasm, he decided to involve more children in the shelter's activities. He envisioned a youth volunteer program where kids could learn about animal care and responsibility while helping to care for the dogs. Over the next few weeks, Dean implemented the program, and it took off. Local schools embraced the idea, allowing students to earn community service hours while interacting with the animals. Lily became one of the program's most passionate advocates, bringing her friends and encouraging them to join. Through these efforts, Dean witnessed firsthand the power of education and compassion. The children quickly developed a bond with the dogs, learning about their needs and how to care for them. They organized bake sales and fundraising events at school, donating the proceeds to the shelter. One crisp autumn afternoon, Dean stood in the yard of the shelter, surrounded by a group of children laughing and playing with the dogs. The air was filled with joy, and he couldn't help but smile. Just then, Claire approached him, her expression bright. "Dean, we've received an unexpected grant from a local animal welfare organization," she announced, excitement evident in her voice. Dean's eyes widened. "What? That's amazing. What does it mean for us?" "It means we can expand our facilities, hire more staff, and even start some educational programs for the community about responsible pet ownership," Claire explained. The news washed over him like a wave of relief. The shelter's future felt more secure, and with the children now involved, he had a renewed vision for what they could achieve together. As winter approached, Dean and Claire planned a community winter woof event to celebrate the season and encourage donations for the shelter. They envisioned a festive gathering where families could come together, enjoy hot cocoa, and celebrate the joy of pet companionship during the holidays. The day of the winter woof arrived, and the shelter was adorned with festive decorations, twinkling lights, colorful ornaments, and a large banner welcoming everyone. Children ran around with excitement, petting the dogs dressed in holiday sweaters, while parents mingled and shared stories. Amidst the joyful chaos, Dean spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. It was the group of men who had confronted him earlier in the year. Dean's heart raced, but he reminded himself that he was here to spread positivity. The men stood at a distance, watching the festivities unfold, their expressions unreadable. Dean took a deep breath and approached them, ready to face whatever they had to say. "Hey there," Dean greeted them warmly. "I hope you're enjoying the event." The leader of the group looked taken aback. We didn't think you could pull this off," he admitted, his voice lacking its earlier hostility. Dean smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "It's been a lot of hard work, but it's worth it to see the community come together." One of the other men spoke up, his tone softer. "I've seen the changes around here. More families are adopting, and the dogs look happy. I have to admit, we were wrong about you." Dean felt a sense of triumph. "Thank you for saying that. It's not just about the dogs. It's about creating a community where everyone feels welcome and cared for." As they spoke, Dean could see the men begin to change their perspective. The barriers that had once divided them began to crumble, replaced by a mutual understanding and respect. The Winter Woof was a resounding success, raising enough funds to ensure the shelter could continue operating through the winter months. Dean felt a profound sense of accomplishment as he watched families leave with newfound joy and furry companions. That evening, Dean and Claire sat in the warmth of the shelter, a sense of peace enveloping them. "Can you believe what we've accomplished?" Claire said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Dean nodded, overwhelmed by the journey. "It's been incredible. I never imagined we could make such a difference in so many lives." Claire leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful look on her face. "And it all started with you, Dean. Your willingness to fight for these dogs changed not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around you." As the cold winter night set in, Dean felt a warmth inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. He had not only created a safe haven for dogs, but had also transformed himself into a leader, a voice for the voiceless, and a pillar of strength in his community. With the shelter thriving and a growing network of supporters, Dean felt hopeful for the future. There would always be challenges, but he knew he could face them head-on. More importantly, he had discovered a purpose that fueled his passion, igniting a fire within him that would guide him forward. As he reflected on the journey so far, he thought of Scott, Shadow, and all the dogs that had come into his life. They had not only been his companions, but also the catalyst for his transformation. Each wagging tail, each bark of joy, served as a reminder of why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the shelter lights, Dean understood that his story was just beginning. The ripple effect. As the new year dawned, the shelter buzzed with renewed energy and ambition. Dean felt invigorated, ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The success of the Winter Woof event had opened up new avenues for the shelter, and he was eager to explore them. One chilly morning, while sipping coffee and reviewing the shelter's finances, Dean was struck by a thought. They needed to expand their reach. They had successfully rescued and rehabilitated dozens of dogs, but there were still many more waiting in shelters across the region. If they could partner with other shelters, they could create a network of care and support that extended far beyond their local community. With this idea in mind, Dean called a meeting with Claire and their volunteers. "I want to discuss the potential for partnerships with other shelters. If we can coordinate efforts to rescue dogs from high-kill shelters, we could save countless lives," he explained, excitement bubbling in his voice. Claire nodded thoughtfully. "That's a great idea, Dean. We could also organize transport to bring dogs here for adoption events. It could be a game changer." The group enthusiastically brainstormed, identifying potential shelters that would be open to collaboration. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan in place. A monthly transport initiative to bring dogs from partner shelters to their own for adoption events. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Dean and Claire reached out to shelters across the state, forging connections and securing commitments. The first transport event was scheduled for early February, and the excitement was palpable. Volunteers signed up to help with logistics, and local businesses pledged support with donations of food, supplies, and promotional materials. On the day of the transport, Dean and Claire arrived at the shelter early, their hearts racing with anticipation. They had arranged for a local transport service to help bring in the dogs, and as they set up, the atmosphere buzzed with enthusiasm. Volunteers painted signs, prepared food, and set up the adoption area, all while sharing stories about the dogs they hoped would arrive. When the transport truck finally pulled up, Dean's heart raced. He could see the faces of the dogs peering out from their crates, each one filled with hope and uncertainty. Volunteers quickly gathered around, ready to welcome the newcomers with open arms. As the dogs were unloaded, Dean felt a swell of emotion. He moved from crate to crate, gently speaking to each dog, assuring them they were safe now. One particular dog caught his attention, a timid beagle mix with sad, soulful eyes. "Hey there, little one. You're going to be okay," Dean whispered, kneeling to her level. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it tugged at his heartstrings. The beagle mix was named Daisy, and Dean knew he had to help her find her way back to trust. As the day unfolded, the shelter filled with laughter, tears of joy, and the happy sounds of wagging tails. Families began to arrive, eager to meet the new arrivals, and within hours, several dogs found their forever homes. Weeks turned into months, and the transport initiative continued to thrive. Each event brought in new dogs, each with their own stories of survival and resilience. Dean watched as Daisy slowly blossomed under the care of the shelter staff and volunteers. With gentle patience, they introduced her to playtime with other dogs and took her on walks, gradually coaxing her out of her shell. Dean worked closely with her, spending time sitting quietly with her, encouraging her to come to him when she was ready. One day, while out in the yard with Daisy, Dean decided to try something new. "Daisy, let's see if you like toys," he said, fetching a colorful squeaky ball. He rolled it toward her, and to his surprise, she sniffed it cautiously before giving it a gentle nudge. Dean couldn't help but grin. That's it, just like that. Gradually, Daisy began to engage more with her surroundings. She would chase the ball tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Her transformation was inspiring to everyone at the shelter, and she became a symbol of hope for the other dogs. If Daisy could overcome her fears, so could they. As spring arrived, Dean decided to host a Spring Fling Adoption Festival to showcase the dogs available for adoption, including Daisy. They organized games, food trucks, and pet-friendly activities to create a festive atmosphere that would attract families from all over the region. The day of the festival was a perfect sunny day, and Dean felt a wave of excitement as he arrived early to set up. Colorful banners adorned the yard, and the sound of laughter filled the air as families began to gather. The volunteers were buzzing with energy, and the dogs seemed to sense the excitement too, wagging their tails eagerly as they greeted visitors. As the festival kicked off, Dean introduced Daisy as one of the star attractions. "This is Daisy. She's come a long way and is looking for her forever home," he announced to the crowd, showcasing her newfound confidence. Daisy trotted around the yard, tail wagging, engaging with the children and their families. Throughout the day, Dean shared stories about each dog, emphasizing their unique personalities and the love they had to give. He could see the impact this festival was having. People were laughing, smiling, and bonding with the dogs. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the event, Dean received an unexpected visitor, a woman named Sarah, who had been following the shelter's journey on social media. She approached Dean with tears in her eyes. "I've been watching Daisy's progress, and I just knew I had to come meet her," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Dean led Sarah to Daisy, who greeted her with a gentle nuzzle. Sarah knelt down, her face lighting up as she interacted with Daisy. The connection was instant and beautiful, and Dean knew in his heart that this was the moment they had both been waiting for. After a short conversation, Sarah filled out the adoption paperwork, and soon, Daisy was walking out of the shelter with her new mom. Dean watched with a full heart as Daisy turned back to look at him one last time, a wag of her tail signaling her new beginning. He knew that she would thrive in a loving home, just as he had hoped. As the festival came to a close, Dean and Claire gathered with their volunteers, sharing in the joy of another successful event. They had adopted out dozens of dogs that day, and the community had rallied behind their mission. Yet, beneath the celebration, Dean felt a growing urgency to tackle a bigger challenge, educating the community about the importance of spaying and neutering pets to prevent overpopulation. Recognizing the critical need for awareness, Dean proposed a community pet care day to Claire and the team. "We need to provide resources for pet owners. It's not just about saving lives, but ensuring responsible ownership," he explained. With enthusiastic support, they began planning. They partnered with local veterinarians to offer low-cost spaying and neutering services, vaccination clinics, and informative workshops about pet care and training. The day of the Community Pet Care Day was a beautiful sunny Saturday, and the shelter grounds were bustling with activity. Families brought their pets for checkups and vaccinations, while others attended workshops on various topics ranging from basic training to nutrition. As Dean walked around the event, he felt a sense of pride in the progress they had made. He chatted with pet owners, answering questions and sharing resources. It was a rewarding experience to see the community so engaged and willing to learn. One family approached him, and Dean recognized the father from a previous adoption event. "Dean, I wanted to thank you for everything. We adopted Max from you last year, and he's become such a part of our family. We're here today to get him neutered and learn how to take better care of him," the father said, holding his dog's leash tightly. Dean smiled, feeling a wave of warmth. "That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear Max is doing well. You're making a great choice for his health and the community." As the day came to a close, Dean reflected on the progress they had made, both in their shelter and in the community. The ripple effect of their efforts was undeniable. They were not only saving lives, but also educating and empowering people to be responsible pet owners. In the months that followed, Dean's shelter continued to grow, both in numbers and reputation. Their partnership with other shelters flourished, allowing them to save more lives than ever before. Daisy's story inspired many, and her success led to an increase in adoptions of dogs who had faced similar challenges. One afternoon, while organizing supplies in the shelter, Dean received an unexpected phone call. It was from a local news station interested in doing a feature on the shelter and its impact on the community. "We want to highlight your work and share the stories of the dogs and families you've helped," the producer explained. Dean felt a surge of excitement. "That would be incredible. I believe it's important to share these stories and spread awareness about the need for rescue and adoption." As the interview date approached, Dean prepared thoroughly, gathering heartwarming stories and testimonials from families who had adopted dogs from the shelter. He knew that this opportunity could significantly impact their mission, reaching an even broader audience. On the day of the interview, the shelter buzzed with anticipation. Dean welcomed the news crew, showing them around and introducing them to the dogs and volunteers. As cameras rolled, he shared the story of the shelter's beginnings and the many lives they had transformed. When the segment aired a few days later, Dean watched in awe as the stories of the shelter's dogs resonated with viewers. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that they were inspiring others to consider adoption and responsible pet ownership. As summer approached, Dean felt a strong sense of community surrounding the shelter. More families were participating in the shelter's programs, and the youth volunteer program was thriving, empowering the next generation to care for animals. With every passing day, Dean was reminded of the profound impact they were making. One evening, while walking through the shelter, Dean encountered a young girl, Sophie, sitting quietly in the play area with a shy puppy named Benny. Sophie had been volunteering at the shelter for months, and her kindness and patience with the animals had not gone unnoticed. "Hey, Sophie," Dean said, kneeling beside her. "How's Benny doing?" Sophie looked up, a soft smile gracing her face. "He's so sweet, but I think he's a little scared. I'm trying to help him feel safe." Dean felt his heart swell. "You're doing an amazing job. It takes time, but with love, he'll come around." Sophie nodded, her gaze returning to the puppy. "I think I'd want to tell my friends at school about him. Maybe they can help too." Dean beamed, inspired by Sophie's passion. "That's a great idea. You can organize a puppy playdate day where your friends can come to play with Benny and the other dogs. It would be a wonderful way to show them how special these pups are." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Yes, I'll ask my mom to help me plan it." As the weeks passed, Sophie's puppy playdate day became a reality, attracting a crowd of excited children and families eager to meet the dogs. Dean watched with pride as Sophie led the event, encouraging her friends to engage with the dogs and share their stories. It was a heartwarming sight, children laughing, playing, and forming bonds with the dogs. Dean felt a sense of hope for the future, knowing that this new generation would carry on the mission of compassion and care. The summer flew by, and with the arrival of fall, Dean decided to host a Furry Friends Festival. This event would celebrate the community's bond with their pets, featuring contests, games, and opportunities for families to adopt new furry companions. On the day of the festival, the shelter was alive with excitement. Dean welcomed families as they arrived, sharing stories of the dogs and the impact of their community efforts. As the sun set, Dean took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. He thought about all the lives they had touched and the community that had come together to support a common cause. With each dog saved, each family united, he knew they were making a difference, one wagging tail at a time. And just as Dean felt a sense of closure for the day, he was approached by Claire, holding an envelope with a smile. "Dean, we received another grant, this time for a community education initiative to promote responsible pet ownership even further," she announced, her excitement contagious. Dean felt a rush of gratitude and anticipation for what was to come. "This is incredible. We can reach even more families and continue spreading the message of love and responsibility." As the festival wound down, Dean looked around at the smiling faces, children playing with their newly adopted pets, families sharing laughter, and volunteers bonding over their shared love for animals. The shelter had become a beacon of hope, love, and community spirit. With the setting sun casting a warm glow over the festivities, Dean felt a profound sense of purpose. He knew this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one where they could continue to advocate for those who could not speak for themselves. And in that moment, he realized that, together, they were not just rescuing dogs, they were building a community united by compassion, kindness, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. The ripple effect of their efforts would continue to spread, inspiring others to join the cause, one wagging tail at a time.